Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning. This is Vernon Oakes, and welcome to Everything Co-op. This morning we have the absolute pleasure of talking to Nathan Schneider, who is a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he talks about media, and we're going to talk about and find out what does he do in media, particularly as it relates to co-op. Good morning, Nathan.
Good morning. It's so good to be here.
Great. Glad to have you. I am a fan of your work. You seem like you have 2,000 articles and 5 or 10 books, and they're thought-provoking. So thank you for your work in this world.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for yours. I'm a long-time listener, but first-time caller. So glad to be with you.
Thanks. Okay, so let's get a little bit about you. Where did you grow up and go to school?
I grew up in Virginia, in Arlington, Virginia. So as my parents met working for the government, and I went to a public high school there that was really my first experience with democracy. It was a kind of alternative school developed in the 70s, where students had a weekly meeting to help make decisions about the school, and I got really involved in that. And when I think back to why I work around democracy and trying to build democratic experiences in the world wherever I go, I often have to recognize that it was maybe those early experiences that got me going. And my first co-op was in college. I studied religion in college as well as computer science for a little while before that. And
excuse me, Nathan. Religion and computer science, they don't seem to go together. Okay. Religion and computer science.
They are the driving mythologies of our world. Maybe I should have put economics in there too, And I just, always just been fascinated by places where people are asking big questions. And but in the meantime, while I was studying those things, I also had my first co-op membership in a housing co-op. That was also a really wonderful experience, enabled me to have lower housing costs, learn how to cook finally, so those got me started.
Where'd you go to college?
That was at Brown in Providence.
Okay.
Wonderful town.
So you're a homeboy in Arlington, Virginia, because I live in D.C. right now. Public high school, got a sense of democracy because it was an alternative school started in the 70s, high school? Yeah,
it was kind of like, maybe if it had been done more recently, it would have been a charter school, but it wasn't set up that way at all. It was before that was a thing. But it was kind of something you got into through a lottery. Actually, one of the things I did while I was there was we changed the admission system to bring in a more diverse student body and that sort of thing. And so that was a big focus. Big question is how do we build a student body equitably? And I was on a committee of parents and teachers and other students. And my math teacher at the time said, "Why don't you chair this committee?" And so I was chairing this committee with grown-ups, and just that invitation, I think, is really profound. That invitation, that idea that you actually have something to offer here, and it's that invitation that I hope my work does somehow in the world, is just that giving more people that sense of confidence that yes, you can co-govern the things that matter in your life, and that to me is what cooperatives do so beautifully. But there are a lot of other ways to make that invitation too.
Well, that is so interesting because Dame Pauline Green, who was the chair of the International Cooperative Alliance, when she made this quote, she said that co-ops help people come out of poverty with dignity. And I've over the years, that may have been 7 years ago, I've over the years have got that when people get voice, when they're invited to chair the committee or invited to say, what do you think about this? And they're heard. That's what causes that dignity to happen in co-ops. That people get a voice, they get a say, one member, one vote in a democratic way. So then to me, that's the biggest thing that co-ops do for people. Much bigger than the financial piece.
That's what it's all about to me. I at the heart of it, I come to it from a spiritual perspective too, that says, that we're made in the image of God, and that we have that dignity in us, and so often our society suppresses that and doesn't allow us to see that, and so that to me is kind of how it all works. But the nice thing about these kinds of, about the co-op movement is we can come together in it from all kinds of perspectives and for all kinds of reasons. But that word dignity is really important for me too.
Yeah, and when you talk about the first principle of cooperation, that it's open and volunteer membership, which you've talked about in your writings, Dame Pauline Green said that, before the Berlin Wall went down, they had people on both sides of the wall on their boards, and the political ideology did not stop the economic realities of trying to get what's best for a family, what's best for humanity. So whether it's political, religious, or whatever, I like co-ops. I think you do too.
I like the good ones,
Okay. Well, I call a co-op only if it's being managed by the values and principles of cooperation, no matter what they call themselves. Because I've seen those that call themselves co-ops and they don't abide by principle one or on down, one member, one vote, and so I don't call them co-ops. You have to run by the values and principles for me to call it a co-op. Yeah.
But I think there's also a sense in which a lousy co-op, something that is set up like a cooperative but is not behaving like one, is an opportunity. For a while I was on the board of an organization called We Own It, and what we did was train and organize members of particularly rural electric cooperatives to make change in their cooperatives. Because in a lot of these cases, they are, perpetuating white supremacy. They are they're sitting on their hands while their members are paying way too much in bills. They're not taking on the renewable energy transformation. They're not doing broadband to the home, things like that. And actually, if you mobilize people in a co-op, you can get all those things. You can get change to happen, even in the context of one it's not behaving like a co-op. And that possibility of democracy, democracy is no guarantee of outcomes, right? It's only the option. It's a different way of solving problems from letting investors run the show. And but it doesn't mean that it's going to work out well, or it doesn't mean that people are going to take advantage of that opportunity.
And I also have it, Nathan, that an engaged membership is the first sign of a successful co-op. If you have a really engaged membership that's trained and know what's going on and participate, and like that professor gave you the option to chair that committee, you're really participating, really engaged, and get to learn a lot. So, yeah.
And that can look so many different ways. I mean, that's something I've been really interested to explore as I look at different kinds of models, both in the digital context and local communities, is that participation it's not all one size fits all. Sometimes I see leaders of co-ops or related organizations kind of blaming their members for not being more involved. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's not the thing that those members want to focus on. And maybe you need to structure the accountability differently. Like, I'm a member of a credit union. I don't have that much interest in participating in it. Like, spreadsheets make my mind explode, and I've been to the annual meeting, things like that. But I don't want to be involved day to day. But my little, several hundred person social media co-op that's like a kind of nonprofit volunteer project exploring the future of social media, that I love being involved in, and that's something I really enjoy putting my time into because it's a playground, and I think we need to also account for for those differences. Like if we win, if we get the cooperative commonwealth, and most of our economy is built around this stuff, we need to be compassionate to each other for like, how are we gonna really participate in all these different things? We're gonna have to be able to pick and choose and have systems so that we can still have accountability without being there every day. And that's like the question I try to ask myself over and over. It's like, what does it look like when we win? How do we get, what does winning look like, and how do we get there?
And when you say we, you're talking about co-ops.
Yeah.
Okay. So how did you get
that old idea of the cooperative commonwealth, of a world that is largely run around economic democracy? That's what this is about for me. It's not, I'm not just interested in playing around the edges of the economy. I think we have some deep problems in our economy that need accountability and democracy, and it's not enough to just be sitting on the sidelines or working under the bleachers.
So the Commonwealth, when you mention Commonwealth, well, first, would you just define that? You did a bit just now, but what do you mean when you say Commonwealth? I think of Virginia as a Commonwealth. Okay,
that's right. It's a word that has a long history, right? And I think of it in the way that cooperators used it about 100 years ago. People like James Warbass, who founded what's now the National Cooperative Business Association. He envisioned a world in which the primary economic activity, not all of it necessarily, but a large portion of it is run cooperatively. And the idea of the Commonwealth is that sense of a different sense of citizenship, that the wealth of the society is shared, is not concentrated, that largely we are engaged in relationships with, in economic relationships that are democratic and where we have a voice and we're able to shape it beyond just our role as consumers. And you see some pretty powerful things. Like you look at a region like Emilia Romagna in Italy, which it's not majority cooperative, but it's like more cooperative than your average region. And you have much more vibrant, civic life, vibrant public services, a lot of shared wealth, a lot of, the kinds of jobs in manufacturing and agriculture that are good jobs, that people are able to access without college degrees, things like that. You just have a healthy society, even with, it's the same way with like union participation. You don't need everyone to be part of a union for the union to actually just really reach how the economy works in a community. And it's that sense that we feel that we are, and the reality that we are really, living among institutions that are accountable to us. That's something we have forgotten how to dream about. But 100 years ago, the cooperative leaders, that was their dream. That was, and they felt like it was in reach. Warbass would, in the front page of all of his books, he would have a picture of like a giant cooperative, like the textile mills of the British cooperative system, or these big refineries run by Western oil cooperatives, trying to just send this message that like we do not have to be small. We can we can run the economy this way.
Well, I didn't know about the co-op, but I knew about this giant co-op and the sixth principle of cooperation among co-ops, where they come together and they manage things. And I was told that like worker co-ops, if it's over 500, it's hard to manage, and I never bought that. I just don't believe in that. There's so many different ways of managing, and I particularly like sociocracy. You talked about some other ocracy, humanocracy, or some other term in one of your books. But
there are all kinds of ocracies.
Yes.
There are a lot of ways to organize ourselves as humans. Yeah.
And so there are different ways of managing it. So like Mondragon, it doesn't have to be limited to 500 employees to manage it, and having everybody have a say in which decisions. Everybody doesn't have a say in every decision, but everybody has a say in those decisions that is important to the work that they perform.
That's right. And there are there are different ways of doing it, right? I mean, like some people like living in big cities, some people like living in small towns, right? Some people are going to want to work for a big industrial firm and they might have less voice on everything, but they get to like play with really cool technology. Others might prefer to work in a smaller environment where the voice is much, much more direct and much more immediate. You know, we can do all of those things and still have that basic accountability of cooperatives. You know, one thing it gets me all the time is people think, oh, it's crazy to imagine we could do co-governance at a large scale. Well, you know, investor owners are doing it already. You know, you look at, a public company, it has countless owners who all have some voice in the governance. Mostly they cede it, to proxies and things like that. But what we're asking for is not asking to change the stakeholders so that businesses are not just existing for the purpose of profit for people who have no actual direct relationship to the business. We're saying, we think organizations should be run in a way that's accountable to their actual stakeholders. And so what we're talking about is not so crazy, even at large scales. And of course, there are lots of different ways we can approach running this. But even if we were just to take the existing, corporate structures that run capitalism, that run investor ownership, and change the stakeholder base, that already is a huge difference, because a lot of the problems that we see, I now work in the tech economy mostly. The problems that emerge are not like so much the day-to-day problems. A lot of people really love working in tech companies, and a lot of users really love, using, Google search or whatever. But the problems emerge in the long term, where it's like, okay, whose side are you really on? Those longer term problems about, okay, where do you, where does your strategy lead? Like, what is your, are you really accountable to those users who are giving personal data? Are you really accountable to those drivers when you have to make a hard decision? Do you choose the drivers or do you choose somebody else? It's those longer term questions I think are where our biggest problems lie, and those have less to do with which fancy governance technique you're using and more about just where does the buck stop? Who ultimately matters when a CEO is lying awake at night trying to make a hard decision?
So in the co-op, it is said it's the members. So it's those taxi drivers that you want to look at, who the co-op is built by and built for. And in a credit union, it's those people that make deposits. In a rural electric, is all of those people that have those little things that run around that tells how much electricity they use, all of those clients. It seems like those are the people that the CEO or management ought to be thinking about long term, because those are the people that become the board members, and the board members are the one that choose who's going to be those managers. So it seems to be that way. But is it?
Yeah, and I talk with a lot of founders who want to build new companies or organizations, especially around tech. And often they, if they come to me, it's because they want to do something the right way, but it's a lot of people, including leaders of, tech companies you've heard of and used, and a question I often ask is, who do you want to be lying awake at night worrying about? Who do you want to be accountable to at the end of the day? And, I never really hear the answer investors,
Okay.
They're accountable to investors because they have to be in order to scale the businesses. But, the answers they usually give are like my workers or my users or, the people who are really bringing value to the thing that I built, who are making the thing I built awesome. And investors are part of that story, but they have gained way too much power in the economy, and it gets in the way of people trying to build good stuff. People who want to, who are just builders and makers and creators, they don't set out in order to create companies that betray the people that, that give them value, those taxi drivers or whoever. They set out to actually empower those people. They often end up having to turn on them because the structure of the capital markets requires them to essentially cede the governance of the company to
investors,
to a certain kind of profit-seeking model.
Well, I got my MBA from Stanford, and I was shocked to find out that Leland Stanford
Oh yeah.
had created laws, as he's in the Senate, for worker co-ops, and he wanted Stanford to teach working co-ops.
Yeah. Whenever I meet a Stanford professor, I remind them of that, and in almost every case, they have no idea what
They
I'm
have no
talking
idea.
about, but I remind them that, so Leland Stanford founded your institution to teach the benefits and rights of cooperation. How is that going?
I've had the
But
same
Stanford
response.
was also a real scumbag robber baron, so this was kind of a, not quite a deathbed conversion, but something close.
Well, that's also interesting. He was a railroad baron. He was the pure capitalist at that period of time. He was the Google folks and the Steve Jobs of our technology world. He was in the railroad business, and to find out that he wanted to and produced these laws, worker co-ops, and he said some great things about workers owning their labor.
Well, and at that time, this was a major idea in the American discourse, right? I mean, the major union at that time in the late 19th century and early 20th century was the Industrial Workers of the World, whose explicit mission was worker control of the means of production. You know, that changed after the 1930s, but this idea that this was a possible solution to what was then understood as the deep conflict between labor and capital, this was just out there. And so you had someone like him who pushed the capitalism project to its limits, was villainized like many, of his peers, rightly so, for being absolutely horrible to workers and to the environment and to many other, to indigenous people and so forth. And realized at the end, we need another way. Mm-hmm. That is something we see. I mean, we see it today with like Elon Musk saying, we're going to have direct democracy on Mars, but he suppresses worker organizing in his factories. It's kind of like, Lord, make me good, but not yet.
Not yet. And not to the workers.
Classic story of capitalism, I think it's really, a question of, we got to take these kinds of things at their word. Let's be serious about how to actually accomplish economic democracy. Because another thing that happened during that time is that, cooperators were able to build real political power. Here in Colorado in 1892, we elected a governor from the Populist Party, which was a third party that was largely driven by cooperatives. And those cooperatives were able to pass federal legislation. It was largely agricultural. That's why we have such a strong agricultural cooperative sector, and they were able to create the farm credit system. There's a $130 billion cooperative bank down the road from me in Denver, CoBank. That's a result of their organizing and their power. They built a parallel financial system for agricultural cooperatives. And then in the 1930s, they did the same thing for rural electrification, solved rural electrification in a decade. This is one of the greatest economic development achievements in our country's history, accomplished very rapidly through, the power that these cooperators built. So I think people like Leland Stanford, they were seeing, this is really real. This is growing. This is powerful. And to his credit, after being terrible for most of his career, he recognized we really need to have a different path. And importantly, he got himself into the U.S. Senate, and realized you need to change the structure in order for this to be any different.
And I, just got inducted in the Co-op Hall of Fame last Thursday.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And in my speech, I talked about the rural electric vote.coop. They put it on. It's a great place to go see if you are registered and who's running in your area, local area, and who's running federal. And I said to them, I'd like to see us do two things in the future, and that is that every co-op becomes a 5-star co-op, and that's every co-op looking to see who's registered vote and how many are voting. There's some other things in becoming a 5-star co-op. But the other one is, I put forth, was that we ought to take a look at analyzing like Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. to see which one of them believe in the values of self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. I always like that it starts off with self and ends up with solidarity. You help yourself by working together. But I also like the ethical values, and I really like to see people being compared with how open you are, how honest you are, where are you with being responsible to society, social responsibility, and in caring for others. And if you just say, okay, here's Kamala Harris, and here's her honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others, and what she's done in the past, and here's Donald Trump as he relates to honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others, and then let people decide based on an analysis of what they've done, not what they say, because sometimes the honesty gets in the way. But that's what I talked about when I accepted this, because I was much more concerned about what we're going to do in the future as opposed to what we've done in the past with cooperation, and really liking, and didn't have the words of a commonwealth. Okay. I like that. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I mean, part of the beauty of this is it crosses those lines. I mean, this is a moment where, our country is facing a real binary choice. But, when the dust settles from November, let's remember that, co-ops are one thing, and economic democracy that cuts across a lot of lines. If you look at the National, Co-op Caucus, it's a very bipartisan group. You've got Republicans who really support cooperatives for Republican reasons, and partly because a lot of Republican districts are dominated by those credit unions and rural electrics and ag co-ops that were built a century ago by these visionaries. And democratic cities are, exploring a lot around employee ownership and cooperative housing and this sort of thing. So it's an opportunity to come together and to, build a coalition that's really different from a lot of other coalitions we see in the country today. And that to me is one of the pleasures of this, working in this movement. We passed major co-op legislation under Donald Trump. We had Bernie Sanders supporting it. It's a different kind of story. It's not about red and blue. It's about, okay, are you interested in community economic power or not?
Yep. Listen, we're going to take our first break, and we're going to come back and talk more about economic power, community economic power. Nathan Schneider, is great talking to you. We'll continue this conversation and see more about the future. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
News Talk 1450 WOL AM, where information is power.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Co-op, and we have Professor Nathan Schneider on with us this morning. Nathan, we are just completed our 11th year this October. We're starting our 12th year on air. And the absolute great news is that NCB, National Cooperative Bank, you mentioned CoBank down the street from you in Colorado. NCB is right here in D.C. They've been our main financial sponsor these 11 years. And NCB's mission is to support and be an advocate for America's cooperatives and their members, especially in low-income communities, by providing innovative financial and related services. And I've had several people from the bank on because, when I took banking at Stanford, it was awful hard to provide loans to low-income communities because they did not have the collateral to put up to make sure the bank got their monies back. But NCB has been able to figure out how to do that, and they've been quite successful in this co-op world. What I wanted to talk about this whole half an hour to talk about the future of co-ops in the U.S. and in the world. And I normally talk about four segments of co-ops. And the first one, if it's the co-op is owned and controlled by the employees, it's a worker co-op. And therefore you can have any co-op, any size, which we talked about, as a worker co-op. And if it's a business is owned and controlled by the people that uses the products or services, the consumer, then it's a consumer co-op. And that's where you get your housing co-ops, your credit unions, your rural electric. REI is a consumer co-op. And the other two are more around ag and businesses, but different people or businesses can come together and form a company to purchase the products or services they need to produce whatever they're going to produce, and that's called a purchasing co-op. And CAI in DC is one of those. It was created for churches and schools, mainly charter schools, to purchase. And we found out that churches were paying 3 times what I would pay as a property manager for my properties for trash hauling. So it really helped them to lower the fees that lay people are running churches, but they could come in and really help, and they help with the contracts and all of that. And then the fourth one is if a group of people come together and form a business to market whatever they produce, okay? It's called a marketing co-op, and if they add value, it's marketing/producer cooperative. And Land O'Lakes, Cabot Creamery, Ocean Spray are all marketing co-ops. And there's a black-owned, woman-owned company in Pittsburgh called Ujamaa. They're artists. And there's also artist co-op in Zuni in New Mexico of Native Americans that have been there 5,000 years, the Zuni co-op. But in Ujamaa, these artists and Zuni, they create jewelry, paintings, clothing, and they sell them. They have a storefront and they sell them online. So these are the 4 types that I talk about. You talk a lot about platform co-ops. How do they fit into these 4 sectors? What is a platform co-op?
It's a hard question, and around the time you were starting this show, I was involved in trying to figure out where the tech economy was going, and there was at the time this idea of the sharing economy, a new kind of business model that actually combines some of those different groups. Right, you had things that like Uber and Airbnb, where ordinary people were using their own cars to do ride sharing, it was called, and then or use their rent their apartments on a platform, often blending some of those categories. Are they workers? Are they doing joint marketing? What's the category? Because the whole idea with platforms is we're no longer, running the business from end to end. We are just bringing people together and connecting people, the power of connection. And in this process, there were some people who kind of didn't get the memo that like the sharing was only skin deep, right? And they were like, okay, let's share the whole platform. Let's build platforms that are owned and governed by the people who use them. So like Stocksy United was an early one. It was a co-op of photographers, really excellent photographers. I use it a lot for stock photo. The platform is owned and governed by both the workers at the company and the photographers around the world who create the work. So these kinds of models started exciting people around 2014. We organized, me and Trevor Schultz at the New School in New York organized a conference called Platform Cooperativism in 2015. And we were blown away. Over 1,000 people came. It was just like a very, very exciting moment where lots of people are like, yes, this is what we want. This solves the problem that we're seeing emerge, where things like Uber are exploiting these drivers. We know where this is going. And we want to build democracy and accountability. And so for the last decade, I've been working on just trying to make that more possible. Building an accelerator called Start.coop with Greg and Howard Brodsky and many others, and just constantly being in community and relationship with people trying to build these kinds of co-ops in the digital context. And, 10 years on is, a decade on is an important milestone in the tech world. Venture capital funds last 10 years. This is the main way of investing in early tech companies. And so in 10 years, you're kind of supposed to be able to show what you're made of, Mm-hmm. And in a lot of the cases here, these things have not taken off. There is no industry where co-ops have replaced, venture capital-backed, investor-owned tech companies, and or anything close. And so I'm really grappling with the fact that that on the one hand, there is still this desire and there's still this need for democracy and accountability in the tech world. But unlike, the farmers and, the people needing electricity in rural communities, in the early 20th century, we have not solved this problem. We have not made it possible for people to build really viable cooperatives in the tech economy. And it's not because it's not possible, I think. It's because we do not have the conditions, we do not have the infrastructure that we need in order to make this really viable.
So what does that infrastructure need to look like? What is that? Laws that have to be put in place, policies? What has to happen?
Well, if you look at what folks did, a century ago again, is a pretty familiar pattern. You'd have experiments, local experiments. This is what happened with credit unions, with rural electrification, with farmer co-ops, where people were able to kind of make it work at a small scale. And we have that in tech co-ops for sure. But then the next step would be, okay, we need to get federal policy to enable us to scale this up in a big way. With the rural electrics, FDR, before he became president, was governor of New York, saw, the local experiments in rural electrification among farmers. And so he knew it could work. And so under him in 1936, they passed legislation to enable large-scale financing of rural electric co-ops through the Department of Agriculture. So over and over, it's the same pattern. You start with the small-scale experiments, you learn some lessons, and then you build the policy that enables you to really work at a large scale. The problem with so much of that legacy is that over and over, we've done it piecemeal. So if you're a rural electric co-op, you can access a lot of capital at a large scale. If you're a farmer co-op, you can access a lot of capital at a large scale. They kept their policy in silos. The problem was they didn't develop general purpose capital access. They didn't develop general purpose tools. And as a result, they're all still in those silos. And new challenges are hard to take on with those tools. So I think we need to approach how we build this movement differently, rather than just trying to build in little boxes and in particular sectors where we're going to solve this problem that investor owners don't seem to be able to solve. Instead, I think we need to build tools that are general, that enable us to solve whatever problems and challenges come our way, whether they're in tech or in housing or anywhere in the economy. That's how the stock market works. It doesn't ask you what industry you're in before you do a public offering. It's general purpose. And I think we need to be building our cooperative ecosystem that way too.
So right now the farmers can go to the Department of Agriculture to get loans.
Right.
And they can do co-op loans or any other loans in the farming world. They've just got Doug O'Brien and NCBA working through the caucus, got the Small Business Administration to do loans for co-ops, which they weren't doing before because of how you collateralize it. And there was not one person that they could go look at to sign the documents as a group. So there were some inherent problems with getting loans for co-ops. And those are the silos you're talking about.
That's right. If you're a credit union, you're concerned about the Department of Commerce and the financial regulators. If you're a rural electric co-op, you're concerned about the one particular office in the Department of Agriculture, the Rural Utilities Office. We have created a movement that is so segmented that actually there's very little benefit in them working together. They're just working in such different areas, and that's a lot of power. And Congress doesn't like to say no to credit unions and rural electric co-ops. They're very powerful. Just imagine what they could do if there were a shared agenda for a financing infrastructure that could actually serve both and also serve the new ones coming up. And here's another piece. I think we need to really focus on what success looks like, on what large scale success looks like, rather than, a lot of our focus has been on, building up, supporting the startups. But what I've seen with startups I've worked with, coming through Start.coop, for instance, is they get off the ground and then they hit a ceiling. They can't grow because there isn't capital access for them. They can't grow the way, if you're an investor-backed startup, you can walk into an investor meeting with a pitch deck and get, millions of dollars. Our co-ops can't come anywhere close to that. And so we need to talk about the top of the market. What does it look like to convert, a major company into a cooperative at the same level that a company would go public on the stock market? I think when you figure out those success conditions, then a lot of those other pieces work themselves out, or they can be worked out. And it's those success conditions I don't hear people talking about in the co-op movement today. And yet, this is what our predecessors did. They did not build rural electric legislation to build a few little, rural co-ops here and there. They built it to solve rural electrification, and they did. Mm-hmm. I want to build infrastructure to solve the deep accountability crisis we have, the deep, worker power crisis that we have in the online economy, and we need the tools that are actually capable of solving those problems.
So I've had Greg Brodsky on the Start.coop. I've had Co-op Sensi on the show that does help with startups. Christina Jennings from Shared Capital that help fund startup co-ops, and NCP. And I don't hear him. Have you talked to them about this idea? Because I don't hear them talking about this idea of creating. What does it mean to have success? Now, they've talked about ongoingly this, how you get funding. Once it gets started and is successful, how do you go and get that next set of funding? What's that deck look like? When you start talking about a housing co-op, you may have 7 people in the deck of funding to get that housing co-op up. So it takes a lot of funding and a lot of coordinating. But when you start talking about a business or a platform co-op, how do you get that funding going where it's not in the silos that you talked about? Because I don't know where you'd put a platform co-op in the U.S. government right now. Okay, where that would even fit. Have you talked to any of these people?
Absolutely. I mean, I know all of them, and Greg and I work very closely. I'm on the board of Start.coop,
okay.
Parent organization, and he and I were talking about this strategy just the other day when he was in town, and I think there are different mindsets. There is the mindset that we can grow kind of linearly. When you work in the around emerging technologies and things like this. Nothing is linear, right? Most startups fail, and the ones that succeed spectacularly,
okay. Yeah,
right? And so it's a very different kind of market, and you want both kinds of markets in a healthy economy. But the main driver of a lot of that innovation and investment is the possibility that those early investors can see a reward and kind of get out, and that's kind of what the stock market is. It's a way for early investors to get out, sell their shares to other people. In the context of co-ops, like imagine a situation where someone building, what if the people building Uber? Uber, by the way, when they did their IPO, when they went on the stock market, they tried to distribute ownership to their users. The government wouldn't let them.
Wow.
Airbnb, same thing. They tried. They wrote legal documents asking the government to let them do this. And the government said, we don't have a framework for it. What if instead of Uber becoming just a publicly traded company, it could actually have a finance conversion when it's successful, as it succeeds, to becoming worker-owned? Now, this is not crazy. This is what, the major form of employee ownership in this country, the employee stock ownership plan, does just that. And the way they did it is a slight change to the tax code for employee benefit plans. It was a little tweak that required one senator. And suddenly that unlocked millions of employee owners, enabling companies companies that were owned usually by one person or a family to sell to their employees. The employees don't have to pay anything. It's all financed. And it becomes a kind of win-win for everybody. It's those kinds of conversions at the large scale that I think we need to be targeting as a movement. That opens doors for the pathways of getting there. It creates a target for the economy to reach for. And it's that kind of target that I think we need to start working around as a movement to make possible a really successful large scale cooperative model. Then the whole rest of the economy is able to say, okay, how do we get there? How do we create an amazing co-op that's going to work really well in that conversion event?
Well, you give a lot of thought. You give a lot of information to think about and figure out how to make this work. And you're giving me what I've been looking for, because I'm wanting to see co-ops really explode, where people, you take Uber or Airbnb. If the people that have their houses up and Airbnb, and I've used them several times, if they own the company, then they have a say in it, where they don't now. They don't have a say in the company.
That's
and
right.
It's interesting that the government stopped that. I did not know that. And the same thing
You
for
should
Uber.
read the Airbnb letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It lays out the most beautiful case for shared ownership and shared governance that you could ever see, which is, they're saying, look, our company was built on the work and sweat of the people who rent their homes on it. And also after COVID, that they had to make some really hard decisions that really worked against those people. And that was also part of the motivation, is they realized, hey, we need to have those people having a seat at the table. Otherwise, we're going to make worse decisions. And so it was kind of a request by necessity. Not to put these companies on a pedestal. I absolutely don't. But I have seen this so many times where, the big bad tech firms, actually, there are people in them that want to do the right thing. It's just that they don't have the option. They don't have a good choice that they can aim for, and so they end up going with whatever works. They end up going with the default. And keep in mind, venture capital was not a mainstream option until the 1980s. In 1979, a small, obscure federal rule changed around pension funds. The capital gains tax changed. Suddenly, then, venture capital became a real model in the economy and is now the dominant engine for the tech economy. But just as venture capital was invented by federal policy, we can also create capital access to enable shared ownership to scale, in large ways. And we've done it in different industries already. So we know this is possible.
So when I got my MBA, it was in 1976 from Stanford. And we didn't study venture capitals, and we didn't study ESOPs, okay? They weren't in existence at that time, okay? ESOPs, I think, started in the mid-'80s or early '80s.
Well, the law passed in 74, but they, took a little while to get going. But of course, you don't see this stuff. And then a few years later, Bank of America, not known as even though it actually gave birth to Visa, which for a while was a cooperative, but not known as a major supporter of employee ownership, opens an ESOP office not because they love worker power, but because the tax benefits worked out for them. They could make a bit of money on it. And suddenly they had an incentive to enable workers to become owners.
So we're talking about getting the federal government to create policies where platform co-ops have a space, but it's all co-ops, but particularly we started talking about platform co-ops.
I will never advocate policy just for platform co-ops. In Colorado here, our farmers created, what in some circles is kind of a controversial law. It's a tool for incorporating co-ops called a limited cooperative association. And it is a very, very flexible incorporation law. So for creating the business. And the thing they forgot to do, that most of our cooperative movement has always done, is say, this is just for us farmers. Instead, they said, you can do anything you want with this. Mm-hmm. And as a result, we're most platform co-ops in the country, all these like tokenized blockchain co-ops, like the most innovative co-ops going on right now, are using that limited cooperative association that our farmers advocated for here in Colorado. And thank goodness they didn't make it just for themselves. They said, we're going to create a general purpose tool, and the future can do with it what it wants. And that's the approach I think we need to start taking, is build tools for creativity. Recognize that communities are creative. They know what their problems are and they want to solve them. We need a solar farm in our community. We need, community-owned broadband. We need a water system that actually works. The communities know what they want. They just don't have the capacity right now to solve their own problems. And so it needs to be general, so that we are creating tools, co-ops for creativity, not co-ops for cookie cutters. In the past, we've always created frameworks on the assumption that we're going to create one model and then we're just going to replicate it. I want to see cooperatives be a tool for invention and discovering, new models. And that's what fortunately our agricultural co-ops here in Colorado did.
Well, your governor is all for co-ops, which I find extremely interesting. I helped Colluminate, a guy named Mark Goring, create a property management company to help what I used to call trailer parks. Mobile home parks is what they're called now. But and too often these folks in these mobile home parks or trailer parks are at the lower end of the economy, and companies and communities that are low income or low resource. So we created this property management company, and it was interesting that we started out in Colorado, and the space seemed to be great for co-ops, whether it's trailer homes or farming or housing, whatever it might be.
That's right. One of the great pleasures of my last few years has been helping our local mobile home park co-op figure out their technology for self-governance, because they just bought out the park, and suddenly now they had to figure out, okay, what tools do we use to communicate with each other? And so I would go there every Friday morning and just sit with them and work through that challenge. And it's a wonderful challenge to have.
If they find, because when I was in property management, one of the hardest things in self-governance was for a member to go say, if you and I are members in the housing, for me to come and say, Nathan, you're behind in your rent or carrying charge or co-op fee, whatever it's called, and then try to collect from you, particularly since we just played cards the night before or whatever. And so too often that gets to be why they'll want somebody in the middle, property manager, community manager in the middle. And if they do, this Colluminate, it's called Common Good Management, is one that could come in and help. Even we've helped people that want to do self-management, how to set that up. So there's all kinds of different ways of doing it, because the goal is how to get people powered. That's the ultimate goal in all of this. Taxi drivers, people that do coding. So how did you get into? You got a degree in faith and computer science. So that's how you're so involved in technology, because of the faith portion of your training.
You gotta have faith, but it's got, and that it does drive me, knowing that that there is something, there is a side of ourselves that we don't see that, I know is there, that capacity for dignity that we talked about earlier, and that does motivate me, but it's grounded faith, right? It's grounded in the fact that, my grandfather grew up on a farm with no electricity, and, because of the Rural Electrification Act, the farm he grew up on got electricity through a co-op. That we've done these things before, and we have we stand on the shoulders of people who had vision that we can build on, and who achieved things that we can expand. And so I think it's a very reasonable faith in this case, but it's true. It requires imagining a world that we don't quite have yet.
So what message do you have to leave people with in the last minute?
For folks who are new to this movement, welcome and come on in and explore. There's so much to discover, and especially take some time to find histories in your community. When I've dug around in the history of my community and my family, I've been astonished how much economic democracy, how much cooperativism I can find. For folks who are working to build in this movement, I just hope we can work together to set our sights higher than I think we have in the last generation or two, and recognize that, we have some pretty powerful ancestors to live up to, and that the people who are coming after us really are depending on us.
Thank you, sir. And everybody out there, you can go to everything.coop, our webpage, and you can nominate your special product, co-op product or service for our holiday list. Just go to everything.coop and put in your product or service. Nathan, thank you so very much for being on and the work you do, and I look forward to talking to you more and reading more of your work. It's challenging.
Thank you, Vernon. Such a pleasure.
And everybody, we'll see you next Thursday. Please live cooperatively.
The preceding program was paid for by Everything Co-op.